Paul goes on in verse 4 to say, certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged. So Paul is quoting the Old Testament there, and he's saying, obviously, that God's faithfulness is not of no effect. The Jewish people, despite their rebellion, does not negate God's faithfulness. God is ever faithful. If we call on Jesus Christ and we turn from Him, He is still faithful. He has saved us and He will not let us go. We lose our rewards, but we do not lose our salvation. And the Jewish people are not rejected because they reject God. Instead, God holds on to them and is ever faithful to them. Paul couldn't be any clearer about this point. Verse 5, but if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts His wrath? I speak as a man. He's asking a very, very obvious question. If we are unrighteous and our unrighteousness demonstrates God's righteousness, then how can God judge us when we're unrighteous? In other words, we're more unrighteous, God should be more righteous. No, that's putting sin in God's face. God is holy and God cannot accept sin. None of it. There must be a way of taking care of the sin, and once that is dealt with, then His righteousness comes into effect. But it cannot come into effect without that way of dealing with Him. In the Old Testament, it was the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, plus other sacrifices they did throughout the year. On the first of the month and at different times during the day, they had these sacrifices. But it did not negate God's righteousness. In verse 6, he says, certainly not, answering the question that was just asked about, is God unjust who inflicts His wrath? Certainly not, he says. For then, how will God judge the world? If in fact God cannot demonstrate His wrath, then He can't judge the world. And then there's no point in there being a Jew. There's no point in there being a Gentile. There's no point in Jesus Christ coming. If we, in fact, don't need Jesus Christ because God can't exercise His wrath, then the cross was pointless. And that cannot be the case. The cross is of ultimate value for the human soul. And it is that which allows the wrath of God to be revealed. Verse 7, he says, for if the truth of God has increased through my lie to His glory, am I also still judged as a sinner? Okay, I lie and God's glory is increased through that. Why? Because God, ever gracious, is willing to forgive me of my sins as a Jew or as a Christian putting my faith in Jesus Christ. When I say as a Jew, I mean under the Old Testament economy. God is faithful to forgive them even when they lie, even when they commit murder, whatever. King David committed adultery and murder, and God forgave him. And His glory is ever demonstrated in things like that. When He forgives people that are under His covenant, then His glory is revealed. But Paul is going to go into it and explain to us that we cannot be licensed or use our forgiveness as license to sin and try to increase His glory, for example. That's not something we can do without being judged by God as a sinner. Verse 8, and why not say, let us do evil that good may come, as we are slanderously reported and as some affirm that we say, their condemnation is just. Some people were saying that Paul was saying because God is His grace is demonstrated and His glory is demonstrated by forgiving us of our sins, then why don't we commit more sins and more sins and more sins? And by doing that, God's glory is even greater. We're giving Him more glory by sinning because it's giving Him more of a chance to forgive us. And Paul says people that say that, their condemnation is deserved because they are taking sin and flippantly putting it in God's face when He was merciful enough to give them a way of atonement to begin with, such as the Day of Atonement or its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. We put our trust in Jesus Christ and we flippantly ignore that, then our condemnation is deserved. Verse 9, he says, what then? Are we better than they? Speaking of the Jews, not at all. For we have previously charged that both Jews and Greeks, that they are all under sin. He went into great detail about that in chapters 1 and 2, that all have sinned. All are fall short of God's glory. And he's going to say that again in verse 3, but just understand that he went through that and said the people that don't have the law, that perform the deeds of the law, are a law unto themselves. Remember we talked about that? All of these things indicate that God is glorified through the forgiveness of both Jews and Greeks. And nobody is better than anybody else. It is God's grace and God's mercy that is demonstrated through these economies that He brings forth in His good timing. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. He's quoting the Psalms, and that is absolutely true. That's not something that we can take out of context and say, well, that's only applying to a certain situation. He is saying that there is none righteous. That means all people on earth. Nobody is righteous. Everybody, even if we haven't sinned, such as a child that's never sinned when it came out of the mother's womb, is already a son of Adam. And he inherited Adam's sin nature, and therefore he is separated from God. As Jesus said, he who does not have the Son is condemned already. We're already condemned because of Adam's sin. We don't need to commit sin of our own, but we do commit sin of our own, and that just leads to more problems. And it also leads to more glory when we are forgiven through Jesus Christ. Not until that point. He goes on in verse 11. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They all have turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. There is none who does good. No, not one. Now, I'd like to qualify something and say that in verse 11 it says there is none who seeks after God. And it is clear when he is saying that, some people use that as an argument for what's known as predestination, saying that only certain people are going to be saved and that God chose them, elected them apart from their own free will. And that is taken out of context because he's speaking from either the 14th Psalm or the 53rd Psalm when he says, the first verse of that Psalm says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And that is speaking of an atheist. But people all around the world are seeking after God. Jehovah's Witnesses, though their faith is misdirected and therefore wasted, are seeking after God. Muslims are seeking after God. Buddhists are seeking after God. The problem is that they're seeking of it under their own righteousness and not that of Jesus Christ. And so please understand that predestination is an entirely different subject, but we must actively be participants in our salvation. God provides it, He elects us, but we must accept it. If we don't accept it, if we don't accept God's gracious offer, then we are condemned. Okay, so please understand that. Going on to verse 13, their throat is an open tomb, still quoting the Psalms and other parts of the Old Testament. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. This is speaking in general terms about the human condition. People that are just continuously rebelling against God. And you don't need to go far to do that. You can walk into the Capitol building behind me and there are people rebelling against God. There are people in the state of Montana who are worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. There are people that are not living their lives in holy manner. And this goes on and on throughout the human society. And each one of us is guilty of it in some part or another. And there must be a remedy, and the remedy is Jesus Christ. Paul makes this argument through the book of Romans, and once you understand the book of Romans, you can fully appreciate why Christ came and what He came to do. Verse 19, he goes on to say, "Now we know that whoever the law says, it says to those who are under the law." Whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, "that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God." What the law says pertains to those who are under the law. As we said, the Jewish people received the law is for them. But people that do the things of the law show that there is a law already written on their own hearts, and therefore we all stand condemned by the law. Whether the law of nature, which God instills in our hearts, or the law of Moses, which God gave to the Jewish people at Sinai, or the law of Jesus Christ, which came through Him when He was born, lived His perfect life, and gave His life up on the cross. We will all be judged by the law of God. Verse 20, "Therefore, by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in His sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin." How are you going to know what sin is unless you have the law? All right? There's the law, as I said, of nature. We know that we're doing something wrong. We know there's a God, and we try to live our lives as if we're pleasing to this God that we don't know. Or we have the law of the Jewish people, and the law of Jewish people says, don't do these things. And when you do them, you're a lawbreaker. You've broken the law. Okay, all of these things point to our need for something greater than a law, than a written law.